Hey Lake Point, Pastor Michael here to get you caught up on the fourth week of our series. And this week was all about getting honest. You see, honesty is the key to forming intimacy and trust, which is something all humans value and desire. Now, many of us wrongly assume that the way to having trusting and intimate relationships is by avoiding conflict with other people. However, life is full of conflict. In every home, marriage, family, workplace, company, church, there is going to be conflict. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. God has given every person on this planet their own mind, will, and emotions. The problem in life is not conflict. The problem is how we handle conflict. When it comes to conflict, if you think about it, COVID really did create the perfect storm. There were opposing opinions. People had very different opinions on how our country should be governed when it came to public health and public policy. There were strong emotions. People felt very passionate about their convictions. And there were high stakes. People were willing to jeopardize their relationships with family and friends over their convictions. Now, the problem with perfect storms is that it is in those moments we tend to behave at our worst. In fact, in those moments, if we're not careful, we can cease to use the rational part of our brain, the part of our brain that makes us separate and distinct from animals, and end up facing these perfect storms with the same intellectual capacity of an animal. Your body starts coursing with adrenaline, blood gets transferred from your brain to your muscles, and as Nate shared, these natural biological instincts are a huge benefit to you when a massive grizzly bear comes charging your way, but they are a huge disadvantage to you when your conversation with your spouse or best friend turns from casual to crucial. You see, when faced with conflict, we often feel our only option is to respond with violence, fight, or silence, flight. We can either speak up and voice our opposing opinions and strong emotions and cause conflict, or we can say nothing and suffer in silence. You know how this works. Think back to when you were a kid and you went to your grandmother's house. Your grandma serves you an enormous slice of her homemade meat pie and asks, "Don't you like it?" But what she really means in that moment is, "Don't you like me?" And you're just a kid though, so you don't really know this, and so you just answer honestly. You say, "No, Grandma, your meat pie is disgusting." But the look of hurt and disappointment on her face says it all, and so you quickly learn something that you never forget. In life, you have two options. You can tell the truth and offend your grandma, or you can be nice and gag through her meat pie every time you come to visit. But here's the thing, as Nate shared, love and truth are not opposites. We see in Scripture that you can actually speak the truth and do it in love. Jesus was the greatest example of this. It's why the Apostle Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15, "Speak the truth in love, growing in every way more and more like Christ." So, the question is, how do you do this? We do so by rejecting the fool's choice that thinks that there's only two choices when it comes to conflict. Violence and silence do not lead to intimacy and trust. They simply keep our relationships stuck. Silence is when we withhold truth. And so Nate shared three common forms of silence are masking, avoiding, and withdrawing. Masking is downplaying or selectively showing our true opinions rather than telling people exactly what we think. We rely on jokes, sarcasm, or snide remarks to let them know what we're thinking. Avoiding is when we steer away from sensitive subjects. We don't address the real issues. When people bring up a touchy or awkward issue, we just try to change the subject. And withdrawing is when we pull out of a conversation altogether. We avoid situations that might bring us into contact with people we're having problems with, and we put off returning calls, texts, or emails simply because we don't want to deal with the issue or the person. You might have done it. It's called ghosting. All of these things involve withholding truth. Violence, on the other hand, violence is when we force truth. And so Nate shared three common forms of violence are controlling, labeling, and attacking. Controlling is when we coerce others to our way of thinking. In order to get our point across, we exaggerate our side of the argument. Labeling is when we dismiss people's ideas by labeling them under a general stereotype. We say things like, "Give me a break, that's ridiculous, only an idiot would think that." And attacking is when we belittle and demean others and make threatening comments. Instead of attacking their ideas, we make it personal and we attack them. So to help combat our propensity of choosing silence or violence, Nate shared the top 5 skills he's learned over the years when it comes to working through conflict. Skill number 1, separate facts from fiction. Did you know we as humans are story-based creatures? In other words, we make sense of our world through story. As such, we're constantly creating stories in our head to make sense of our experience. Here's the problem. most of the stories we tell ourselves are inaccurate. I mean, yeah, we have heard somebody say or do something, but we don't know the motive behind why they said or did it. Likewise, we don't know the full context surrounding what they said or did. All we know is what we heard or what we saw. But instead of getting the full scope, what do? We fill in the missing pieces. Somebody says or does something and we fill in the missing pieces of the story. We determine motive and form conclusions around what they said or what they did. Why? Because our brains are wired to do so. Our brains are wired to make up stories, to explain things that cause us hurt or shame, and chemicals are actually released in our brain that reward us for doing this. That's why we naturally make up stories in our head whenever someone has said or did something that has hurt us. But here's the terrible thing. Our brain rewards us for making up these stories, whether they're true or not. And worse yet, we live out the stories that we tell ourselves. It's why we must learn to master the stories in our head by separating fact from fiction. Facts are actual occurrences. Stories are judgments, conclusions, and attributions that we make from the facts. We need to learn to separate the two. And the easiest way to do that is by asking yourself this question: what is the story in my head? The second skill to master is skill number 2, which is clarify what you really want. When you're experiencing conflict, you need to actively re-engage your brain so that your emotions don't override you. The best way to do that is to ask yourself a question. And now, questions are great because they force your brain to think and re-engage your full cognitive capabilities. The best question to ask is this: what do I really want? Here's why. When faced with conflict, our motives can change without any conscious thought. We can go from healthy motives to unhealthy motives in a nanosecond. We can go from wanting to resolve the issue to wanting to win the argument. Or worse, we can go from wanting to win the argument to wanting to inflict pain, to make them actually look bad. On the other end of the spectrum, we can go from wanting to resolve the issue to just wanting to keep the peace. Or worse, we can go from wanting to keep the peace to lying and being dishonest with ourselves and with them. So to find our bearings, we need to ask ourselves 3 very important questions. Ask yourself, what does it look like I want? For example, do I want to win, punish, blame, look good, save face, keep the peace? What do I really want for myself, for others, for this relationship? And then, how would I behave if I really did want this? Now, those questions lead us to the next skill, skill number 3, make the conversation safe. Share intent before content. People are always assessing intent. Every time you speak, they are trying to discern your motive. Why are you saying what you're saying? Candor is never the problem. People do not get defensive about what you say. People get defensive because of why they think you're saying it. It's the intent, not the content, that provokes defensiveness. It's why if you want to engage in meaningful dialogue, whether neither person has to revert to silence, or violence, you have to make the conversation safe. A conversation is safe when 2 key elements exist. Mutual purpose, you demonstrate that you care about their interests and goals, and mutual respect, you demonstrate that you care about them as a person. When you do this, they start to relax and listen because they are no longer fixated on your motive or your intent. All right, skill 4, speak with humility. Make observations, not accusations. Make I statements, not you statements. For example, we often say things like, you never listen to me, or you never call or text me, but we can change those to easily like, I feel like I'm not being heard, or I'm feeling disconnected from you. And then once you've made that transition, you can move on to the 5th skill, and it's this: invite dialogue. Ask them, what am I missing? Help me understand. Think of a ping pong tennis table. You know, the goal of ping pong is for the ball to bounce back and forth from one side of the table to the other. This is how a conversation is supposed to work. This is how conflict resolution is supposed to work. But what do most people do? They grab the ball and they don't let go. All that does is show your true motives, that you're not there to engage in meaningful dialogue. You are there just to win an argument. The truth is, nobody wins. When you win an argument, everyone loses. You lose, they lose, everyone loses, because we miss out on intimacy and trust. Well, friends, thanks for listening. Hopefully you can put those skills to use. Enjoy getting honest with each other during the discussion time. I'll see you next.